The Inside the Rails podcast is supported by Great British Racing and In the Paddock. InThePaddock.co.uk is a great place to start your shared ownership journey. Find racing clubs and syndicates with horses trained locally to you and at a cost that fits your budget using the search tools on the website. Within the Paddock, your ownership journey could start sooner than you think.
Hello, my name is Simon Double and welcome to Inside the Rails, a monthly podcast for horse racing enthusiasts everywhere. And as ever, I'm joined by my co-host Phil Boyle from BG Racing, fresh from the fields of Fontwell, I believe.
I am. Hi, Simon. Yes, apologies first up for the croaky voice again.
What, another one?
Yeah, I need to assure listeners I haven't been ill for a full month. It's just that having got rid of the bug I had before Christmas, I managed to get another cold just in time for the January recording. So it is a different one, but it makes me sound the same. Thankfully, it hasn't stopped me, though. So we're recording this on the 29th of January, and I am fresh off a busy weekend. We had the Cheltenham Festival Trials Day on Saturday. I had a shareholder social and breakfast at Neil Mulholland's yard in Bath on Sunday morning. And then, as you accurately said, I came across the country to go racing at Fontwell, where our horse Bella Cavalla was making her debut.
That's easy for you to say. Look, you have been busy. I saw Bella Cavalla was making a debut, and I did actually look at her run. We'll talk about her and your other activities later on. But I need to say to listeners, I'm delighted to say we've got a very special guest, Paul Johnson, CEO of the National Traders Federation, as our special guest later on.
Brilliant. And obviously, after consecutive Frankies last year, when we had Francesca Cumani and Frankie Foster as our guests, we're now having consecutive Johnsons, having had Richard last month and Paul this month. So, not sure there's another Johnson we can add next month, but it'll be good to find out more about Paul and his role with the NTF.
Well, despite the croaky voice, you haven't lost your sense of alliteration there with the Francesca Cumani and Frankie Foster. Very impressed there, Phil. Now, regular listeners will know we often start off the podcast talking about our syndicate horses, so I'll get the ball rolling. There's not a huge amount to say in terms of Solaria Racing runners because my horses are very young this year. So we've got Sharp Distinction, who's a 5-year-old, but he's been on holiday, although he's just come back from Martley Hall Stud this weekend. So he's now back in training. 3-year-old Baron Barolo, who didn't run last year, he's now trotting and doing very nicely. Gosh, he's really grown, and he's being primed for the start of the turf season.
That sounds good. No doubt it'll be busier for you going forwards. I know that the flat turf season is your busiest time of the year. And you mentioned last month you might have an early 2-year-old runner this season. Is that still on track?
Yeah, I don't want to say too much, but yes, the Mahatha colt, he could be quite early and he could be half decent. He's yet to do any really serious work, but he's a very straightforward colt. And yes, he is still a colt. We haven't gelded him yet. And Phil, I'm quietly excited about him. What about the BG Racing horses? Think you've been quite busy, haven't you?
I have, yes. Strider has run 3 times since we last recorded. And Bella Cavalla was in action yesterday, as we mentioned. Strider ran before Christmas. It was actually the day after we recorded the January podcast. He went to Kempton over 7 furlongs. But I must admit, he was far too keen. He was ridden by Jack Mitchell that day, and he pulled poor Jack all around the track trying to get to the front. So after doing that for about half a mile, he had no energy for the end of the race and ended up finishing last. Jack suggested we drop him to 6 furlongs on a course like Wolverhampton. We did exactly that at the start of January. He finished 8th there, but it was a much better run. He did lose about 5 places in the last few yards as he just couldn't keep up the pace to the line. He looked like he was going to get placed for a long while. Rab Havlin rode him that day and he suggested that we might want to drop him to 5 furlongs. And we did that at Chelmsford last week when he was beautifully positioned throughout the race and ran a cracker to finish 2nd. He was only beaten a neck for the win. So, yeah, evidence would indicate that running him over 2 furlongs further for the first 2 starts for us might not have been the right plan.
Well, it sounds as though you're getting to the bottom of Strider, who's certainly going the right direction. What about Bella Cavalla, who made her debut yesterday?
Yes, that was in a flat race for jumps horses. As you all know, they're often called bumpers due to the inexperienced horses that contest them. There can be a bit of bumping going on. And yeah, she had even less experience than several of the others because some of them had raced in point-to-point races before and a couple of them had racecourse experience. So yeah, she certainly was giving away an experience disadvantage to the others, and we were really pleased with her. While she was only 8th, she showed a really great attitude. She ran all the way to the line. She was just a little bit outpaced early in the home straight, but she's bred for longer distances than yesterday. So, yeah, I'd probably stick my neck out and say that I think she'll win some races once she gets into handicap company and is running against rivals of a similar standard.
I actually thought she ran really well, Phil. The Racing Post verdict, I think, said that or the Racing Post analysis, said that she ran a bit free. I thought she ran well, didn't you?
Yeah, we were very pleased with it. Yeah, I didn't think she ran too free. I did see that as well. I thought she settled actually quite well, but just got a little bit outpaced, but there was no disgrace in that, I don't think.
Excellent stuff, excellent. Now, you mentioned your social event for your owners. How did that go?
Yes, we've had 2, actually. An excellent stable visit to Neil Mulholland's yard yesterday, toured around the stables with Neil, and we went off for breakfast afterwards at a local farm cafe. And then last week, we had an event at Lingfield Park. Obviously, hopefully, most shareholders could get to one or the other of those. And we had a full English breakfast in the hotel adjoining Lingfield, and then we had the afternoon at the races in the Syndicate Lounge. Both were excellent events, quite well attended, and everybody that did come along really enjoyed them. I know that you run a lot of social events for your shareholders as well, and I think they really add to the syndicate ownership experience.
Absolutely.
Now then, I heard a rumour that you were going to join us at Lingfield, but you had another engagement that evening, and one that I understand turned out to be quite dangerous.
Well, yes, Phil, I was hoping to turn up at Lingfield, but I had a Burns dinner and dance engagement in the evening. And while basically that shouldn't have stopped me turning up to Lingfield, I had to do a bit of shopping. I noticed that my dress shirt has seen better days. Anyway, found a very nice dress shirt, and I was having a fabulous evening. It was at Berkhamsted Town Hall, actually. Very nice building. But there was a particularly very vibrant, enthusiastic table of 10 30-somethings. All was going very well on the dance floor until one of these 30-somethings, one young lady, swung me round rather violently, and I heard my back go. So it was off to the osteopaths fairly sharpish on Monday. Fortunately, it was only muscular, but it will probably teach me or at least remind me that I really shouldn't try to keep up with women half my age. Actually, it probably won't. Anyway, it was all good fun.
Oh, dear. Why is it that we always seem to think we can still do all the things that we could do several years ago? I've mentally now got a picture of Scottish dancing, and I think they dance around swords in Scottish dances as well, don't they? So the back injury is probably your body's way of preventing you from coming away with only one foot that night.
Are you saying I've already got one foot in the grave? I don't believe it. Now, changing the subject, you were at Cheltenham Trials weekend, weren't you? Good to see some quality jumps racing after we've lost quite a lot of racing due to the frosts and very cold temperatures of late. Your take on the jumps racing so far this year, Phil?
It certainly was a cold couple of weeks in January. Felt sorry for the old groundskeeping teams that were out on the courses covering 2 miles of racecourse with fleece covers and then finding the ground still too frozen underneath for them to get the races on. There was some good action back at Christmas. I thought Constitution Hill looked awesome again, and Galopin de Champs looked back to his Gold Cup winning form when he raced in Ireland. And this weekend at Cheltenham, I thought Sir Gino looked very special in the juvenile hurdle. I think it'll take a very good one to beat him in the spring festivals. Capodanno came over from Ireland. He was behind Galopin de Champs last time, and he won well in the big race on Saturday at Cheltenham. So, yeah, that's making the Gold Cup favourite look even stronger. And I thought whilst John Bon was beaten, I think he probably would have won if not for a bad mistake at the top of the hill. And of course, Lossiemouth, she looked very good. It'll be hard to see her getting beaten if she stays away from Constitution Hill, and I think that is the plan.
I think I agree with you about Jean Bon. I didn't think his run was as bad as some people made out. The Racing Post verdict said, quote, it was a miserable round of jumping. I think that's slightly over-egging the pudding. Yes, he put in a howler 4 out, and there were another couple of mistakes, but As Nicky Henderson said afterwards, had he winged the last, he might well not have let the other horse, Elixir de Nuts, get back up to him. He's out to 9-2 for the Champion Chase at Cheltenham. I think that could look a bit generous come the day. What do you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't put anybody off of that. That's for sure. Big rival from Ireland that day, but I still thought he was the best horse on the day on Saturday.
Now, this particular Cheltenham fixture that you were at was a premier fixture, something which has been introduced to offer good prize money and focus attention on the stars of racing. There are 170 premier fixtures planned for jumps and flat this year, many on a Saturday, and between 2 and 4 o'clock, you've got a 2-hour window there. There's a limit on the number of other fixtures which can take place. Like a lot of issues in racing, this one has caused differing opinions. Your take on it, Phil?
To be honest, I think these have received a bit more negativity than perhaps they should. A lot of people seem to think there should be some kind of fanfare and show around a Premier Race Day. I heard someone say that when it's a Champions League night at the football, you know it's a Champions League night because of the banners and the music and the atmosphere. We do have some banners at the racecourses, so I wonder if it's just the fact that we haven't got a Premier Racing theme tune. But, seriously, whilst the atmosphere on Champions League nights is great, that does come from the quality of the action on the pitch. And these Premier fixtures are being given top billing on a Saturday afternoon, which hopefully means that the media can focus on those meetings rather than interrupting coverage to cover something small elsewhere. Maybe that'll help focus people on the top action and deliver a bit more of that buzz and atmosphere. So whether it has the desired effect remains to be seen, but it is a trial and I think it's worth giving it a chance.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And on another issue, did you see that the idea of restricting 4 runners per trainer in a race, something we've talked about very recently, that idea has been scrapped? From a restriction of trade point of view, I think that's a good decision. You may not agree.
I saw that. I think, like I said last month, I still think there's some scope to restrict the number of runners in a race from the same owner, but that's probably one for another day. Anyway, before Paul joins us, I wanted to know if you joined in with the Free Hexham campaign.
I know it was on Twitter, or X as we're supposed to call it, but I must admit, Elon Musk seems to be running the social media platform into the ground. So I'm not as active on Twitter or X as I have been in the past. Anyway, explain all.
Yes, it was quite an amusing one. As you mentioned, when Twitter was taken over by Mr. Musk, several people who'd been blocked on there in the past for being too controversial, they seem to be welcomed back onto the platform. So it was quite ironic that a decision was then made to ban Hexham Racecourse. I'm not sure who took exception to their photos of their fences or notices of upcoming race days. But thankfully they were only off for about 48 hours before they were reinstated. But it was enough time for racing users on Twitter to have some fun with it. There was a Free Hexham campaign going on people's posts, and even their local MP got involved on their behalf.
Well, I'm glad it was satisfactorily resolved. Although, look, I guess there are rather more important things going on in the world. Anyway, I'm delighted to say we have our special guest, Paul Johnson, on the line. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Yeah, very well, Simon. Thank you.
Well, look, thank you very much for giving up your time. You've obviously got a very busy schedule in your job as head of the NTF being the National Trainers Federation, the body which represents trainers in Britain, and you've been in that role for about 2 years now. How have you found those 2 years, and is the job what you expected?
It is what I expected. It's been a busy 2 years, to say the least. I think perhaps I've been a bit surprised by the volume of work coming in at the time that the industry needed a new governance structure, and we had a lot of work to go with that. The industry strategy obviously flowed out of that structure as well, and it's been plenty going on, and at the same time we've had other bits and pieces thrown in, FCA investigations and other quite time-consuming pieces of work for us to get through. So it's been a good 2 years, but pretty full on.
Now, you've held several key positions within the racing industry throughout your career. Can I ask, how did you get into racing? Is there any racing or horsey background in your family? What's the Paul Johnson story into racing?
There's very little horsey background, I wouldn't say. I went as far as having riding lessons at a young age at my aunt's riding stables, her commercially unsuccessful riding stables, was deposited on a very compliant horse called Sleepy, who is exactly that. And he would steer me around a muddy paddock. And it's fair to say that that was probably the pinnacle of my riding success. I don't think I could even ride to that level now. So not much of a horsey background. Probably came into the sport more through a route that others have said to me in the past, through my grandparents, watching BBC racing, ITV racing, or Channel 4 racing when I was younger. My nan would have the good grace to put on the odd Yankee for me at an age when I probably shouldn't have been putting on Yankees. And I became involved in that way. That was to start with. As I got older, I actually went racing. I did start going racing a bit more in person. Went to the evenings at Windsor, flat turf racing at Kempton. Used to go to the Ebor each year, stay up in York, and start to enjoy racing for what it had to offer. Moving on from there to actually get into racing, to work in racing myself, I went to university. I started working at Coral and I worked at Ladbrokes, and it was all because of my interest in horse racing. And after a number of years of working at Ladbrokes after I finished university, I decided to take a different route, and it became clear to me that Ladbrokes probably weren't as focused on horse racing as a product as they had been in previous years, and it was time to change path. So I came away from that and accepted that I wasn't going to be working in racing anytime soon, and had 4 years working at Procter & Gamble before the job at the Racecourse Association came up, and I was sent the advert for that from my sister, and who talked me into applying against my better judgment, and I was fortunate enough to land that job.
So you mentioned you worked for the Racecourse Association. What was your role there?
So I went in as racing executive, and so the role really was looking after the 59 racecourse members and looking after their race planning needs. They're running the fixture list process, representing racecourses there. At that stage, there were the small independent racecourses, the large independents, and there were 3 racecourse groups back then as well, Arena and Northern, who later merged to become ARC, and the Jockey Club. So trying to balance all their often conflicting needs to come up with something that would work for the racecourses as a group. And that was really the job there. It was a very steep learning curve to pick up all the intricacies of fixtures and funding. And I was fortunate really to be surrounded by some really good people, most of whom are still in the sport, who ran racecourses and were extremely supportive of me coming in with very little experience of the actual nuts and bolts of horse racing.
Now, you've also worked, haven't you, at the BHA, the British Horse Racing Authority, as head of racing, I think for about 8 years. Again, what did that job entail? That
was really a follow-on from the RCA job, actually, doing similar areas of work, race planning, fixture list. And I had a period when I was at the RCA where I think Richard Wayman had left BHA, and they had a slight gap as to who would look after the fixture list work there for them. So I was doing a lot of that at the RCA, and it became a slightly natural move for me to move across to the BHA and pick that up on a more wider industry level. Ended up running the racing department and the race course department as well for a period of time, and I had some really good times there. So fixture list, race planning, the specifics of the race program, and I had a really good team of people there that understood all those things far better than I did, but had the good grace to put up with me and get on with it. And it was in contrast to what I used to read on social media. There were very hard-working individuals there, very passionate about the sport. None of them wore tweed. We didn't have gin and tonics at lunchtime either, contrary to what I read. And it was a good 8 years of my life that I really enjoyed. And I didn't really think that it would be something that I'd rush to move on from, because in some ways I'd wake up and pinch myself a bit and feel how lucky I'd been to position myself into a role that I enjoyed so much.
So you've obviously got quite an interesting CV in racing. Now, racing, sadly, has had a reputation over the years for the various stakeholders. So groups representing trainers, jockeys, racecourses, owners, etc., not always getting on, and that's putting it mildly. Do you think having worked for various stakeholders gives you an added perspective in your current role at the NTF?
It definitely gives me a perspective that is not very helpful at times, the way the sport conducts itself, or those within the sport conduct themselves. And there's no doubt that we would be better off, I'm sure, to try and all row in together. And that's what what we're trying to do now. That's the way things have moved on under the new governance structure that I referred to. One of the difficulties is that if you try to act in the right way and try and behave responsibly and work effectively with everybody, you need to see at some point some rewards for that, and that those that aren't doing the same thing don't get rewarded. And that's a challenge for the BHA, I think, to make sure that they're not always just listening to those who shout loudest, but are actually having proper considered discussion with stakeholders.
Do you actually think it's getting better? Do you think the stakeholders are talking with each other better than they have done in the past?
I'd say it is. It's better now. Yeah, I'm certain it is. The challenge with that is that any new governance structure is always going to probably enjoy its best moments to start with. So we need to make sure that we keep doing that, and that when things get difficult, we don't revert to type and go back to being quite confrontational with each other. The big focus for me at the NTF, and the big thing that I have taken out of what I've done before, is that the sport is lacking a vital piece of the process whereby money flows from the various inflows into the sport, betting, media, etc., and owners, and how that flows through racecourses and flows back down to participants and the owners again. And we're working very hard to try to agree commercial partnerships with racecourses, and just see that as essential to define some sort of fair share flowing down through the sport into those that are driving it, to make sure, if nothing else, that everybody can then work together to try and focus on what really matters, which is making sure the sport's got a long-term future. And sometimes our slight short-term arguments take over the need for that longer-term perspective.
That's good stuff to hear, Paul. And if I can just change the subject a little bit, obviously, this podcast, Simon and I set up to try and make people aware of opportunities in racehorse ownership, particularly through syndication. And obviously, for many people, syndication is very important to the future of the sport. What's your view on syndicates and what they have to offer? And have you ever been in one?
I see them as a huge opportunity for the sport. I think everybody does at the moment. The profile of ownership's evolving, and we know that's going to happen. And we look at some other jurisdictions where syndicate ownership or shared ownership is quite widespread. My only experience of ownership was going back a number of years, and was through a racing club more than a syndicate itself, with a number of members and a share in a horse. And this was quite some time ago. And in truth, it wasn't really a particularly good experience for those involved in it. There were some process technicalities around the horse being able to run, and there were other bits and pieces that went on. I mean, the horse did a lot better after we weren't involved in it anymore, actually, but which was it was nice to see for the horse, but it would have been nice in our tenure as well. And I think that's a really important learning for me, is that if the sport's going to go on this journey, then it needs to be ready to do that, and we need to make sure that we've got the right structure in place to make sure that people are able to have a really good experience, because there are some really good experiences to be had out there, and I wouldn't put anybody off shared ownership. But we need to make sure we always get it right, because the sport can't afford to have people that have a poor experience and decide they're not going to do it again. It's a competitive market out there for those running those syndicates and clubs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure Simon and I would echo that in terms of, the importance of a good experience for shareholders. Obviously, we're both professional syndicators, and I'm sure you'll be aware that many of your trainer members of the NTF also run small partnerships and syndicates themselves. So with professional syndicators having to abide by, codes of conduct and best practice processes, and an intention that we should maybe be licensed in future, do you have a view on how that should apply to trainer-led syndicates?
Well, my own view would be that you need regulation that covers everything and everybody, because the expectation level is the same across any consumer of racing. They need to have a good experience. So I think it's reasonable to say that should be applied everywhere. I suppose the difference between individuals who are professional syndicators or external to licensed personnel is exactly that. They're not licensed. So trainers are already licensed by the BHA. So I would imagine there are a number of areas where you can avoid duplication in the work you do to manage or license those syndicators, or be they trainers or otherwise.
Look, we've really enjoyed having you on Inside the Rails. We always like to finish with a question which we ask all of our guests. If you could change 3 things in British racing for the good of British racing, what would they be?
It's a really good question, isn't it? And people could very easily listen to this and think, well, you're sitting at the table to try and change those things. So if you think these things should change, why don't you change them? But as we've already acknowledged, that racing's not ever quite that simple, and there's a number of people to pull together into that. I think if it were me, I'd have quite a clear thought on strategy. I think the first thing I've already touched on, that you put in place, I'd like to see commercial agreements put in place for where the money flows in racing. And I think that's the foundation stone to an awful lot of things. So I think that needs to happen. The second one and the third one, both linked, are that racing needs a longer term strategy for ownership and to address the decline in the higher quality horses that are running in this country and that are keeping Britain's place on the world stage. Because there are probably a number of things over the years, some of them which we're less worried about than others, where Britain has been a world leader and no longer is. This one is, I think, one we care about quite a lot. And if we're to maintain that place, we need to make sure we've got a strategy to breed and race high quality horses in this country. And I did notice the Longines World Racehorse Rankings last week. The speech that was given by the Japanese connections referenced the fact that Japan wanted to have an impact on the staying division and put the Japan Cup in place, I think, in the 70s, and have just for the first time had a horse that is a staying horse that's top of the world racehorse rankings 50 years later. So the fact that the Britain's strategy seems to, at the moment, only extend for the next 18 months probably is insufficient to get us where we need to go. And then the third part of that would be a similar strategy for the consumer and for racing's customers. And I've said this before to people that when you're in racing, we all watch horse racing and we feel a certain way when we do that. And we do that because somewhere along the way we've gone that pathway, whether that's through your grandparents sitting in front of the racing as it was me, or whether it's riding or betting or whatever those other things might be. But there are an enormous amount of people out there that don't really feel anything when they watch horse racing because they haven't been taken on that pathway. And that pathway could be watching racing on TV, which becomes attending, which becomes annual racecourse membership, racing UK subscriptions, shared ownership, then sole ownership. And so you got, and it doesn't feel to me that racing is ever very good at looking 10 years down the line and focusing on creating that pipeline of who are the next generation of people who are going to love and cherish our sport and make sure that we're thriving. And I think more needs to happen.
That's really, really very interesting, Paul. What I found very interesting was that all of our guests, virtually to a man and boy, have mentioned prize money. You didn't actually mention the word prize money, but you've alluded to it in terms of money flowing in. So clearly you've got a passion for this sport, and you've got some far-thinking strategic ideas as to how it should go. Look, I think being head of any organisation in racing is not easy. So thank you very much for being on Inside the Rails. And Phil and I wish you the very best of luck for the rest of the year with the NTF. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Well, Phil, another great guest. Don't you agree? I think what was interesting about Paul was, apart from his passion for the sport, I don't think we've had a guest on who's had so many key roles in the racing industry, have we?
No, absolutely. And nice that somebody that's sort of got a bit of influence in the sport there is so focused on the overall good of the sport. We've always talked about people sort of fighting for their own needs, fighting other stakeholders. But Paul did genuinely seem to sort of have what was for the good of the sport at the heart, which I think is great to see. Before we toddle off for another month, I get a couple of weeks without a cold, and then I'll try and get one again for the next recording. I wanted to finish off by encouraging our listeners to get involved in shared ownership, as we always do. It really is a brilliant experience. Simon and I would be delighted to chat with you if you're interested in getting involved in shared ownership. And there's loads of different options out there. Great British Racing, who generously sponsor our podcast, have an In the Paddock website, which you can log on to and find a syndicate or racing club that can provide you with a shareholding at the right price in the right location. So Please also support Inside the Rails by following us on your podcast platform of choice to get new episodes when they're released. And please, of course, as always, tell people all about us.
Well, that just leaves me to thank our sponsors, Great British Racing, co-host Phil Boyle from BG Racing, producer Callum Ronan from Callum Ronan Creative, special guest Paul Johnson, and of course, you, the listeners. Christmas, New Year, and Burns Night celebrations may have come and gone, but I can almost hear the Cheltenham roar as the tape goes up for the start of the Cheltenham Festival 2024. This is Simon Double from Solaria Racing saying, thank you for listening to Inside the Rails, and goodbye.
The Inside the Rails podcast is supported by Great British Racing and In the Paddock. InThePaddock.co.uk is a great place to start your shared ownership journey. Find racing clubs and syndicates with horses trained locally to you and at a cost that fits your budget using the search tools on the website. Within the Paddock, your ownership journey could start sooner than you think.